We're going to do one more thing, and then we're going to take a break. And this presentation is meant to really unpack the money, the resources, and what we've been talking about, even in this first hour, about what it means to meet this moment. As we've traveled across New England, the Midwest, and now in the South, one of the feedbacks that have been very clear from all of the participants was that it was critical that we had an opportunity to really unpack both the federal funding that's flowing and what it means to mobilize for action up front. We usually do this information later on in the day after you've gotten a little bit more time to meet each other, but we thought it was critical that you had everything that you needed to know up front before we actually dive into really organizing collectively over the next few days. If you all can pull up the slides. So I want to talk a little bit more about, do you have the clicker? I want to talk a little bit more about Communities First, our work, and how we've been really thinking about what it means to meet this moment. For us, what we are sitting in is the history that we got grounded in with Ms. Vivette, and that, thank you, communities have been organizing for a very long time. And what I'm sitting with is I-84 even behind us. And later on today, we're going to go downtown, into downtown Durham, and look at Black Wall Street for Durham. The reality is that we have been living in thriving communities for decades. And we know that systematically what has played itself out, particularly when we think about past infrastructure investments. And I'm a transportation person, so I had the privilege 10 years ago working at the U.S. Department of Transportation under Secretary Fox at the time, and he talked about what it means to reconnect communities. But he also really helped to ground the history of how we built out our interstate system. And at the time, we were at war when the first ideations of what it meant to connect our country from coast to coast. And when you think about what it means and the power of access that was offered for folks to travel from the South. I mean, when we were in the Midwest, folks talked about their own origin journeys into places like Detroit. And I'm holding Samia where she talked about her grandmother took her children after Emmett Till's passing and put them all in a car and everything that she owned, and they went as far as the gas could take them. And for her, from Mississippi, the stop was Detroit. And that's where they've lived for several generations. And I just uplift that because when we start to talk about this investment and why it is so transformational, is that the green books that helped us to decide how to navigate our ancestors or even some of our elders, how to navigate all that we have seen systemically has come from an understanding that we have agency and full power, and we always have, that there is a sheer spirit in us that helps to guide and be the North Star for how we move. And for us, what we wanted to do was really think about how do we support communities and putting them first. We knew that the political cycles may come in such a way that when we start to talk about race and class, it offers a division that doesn't offer us the same space to organize. But when we think about the ways in which communities have been historically negatively impacted, if we center those who have been most impacted and solve for those challenges, we may be able to build a more just and thriving community. And something that I really appreciate that Helen always reminds me, and we met during my time in the administration, at that time, sustainable communities was the narrative. And it was planning grants across the country, but there was no capital funding. You couldn't take those plans to actual implementation. And at the end of this presentation, you will be able to understand where the capital funding will be flowing and how you take access of it. But when people talk about the fact that this is a generational shift, the difference is the resources that are now being made available. We have had resources for planning. We have not had this level of capital funding that is getting ready to flow. And I want you to fully understand that, and you'll get it even more. But what we are really supporting is, how do we build the capacity for more equitable investment? How do we ensure that communities are in a place to self-determine the vision that they see, not just for today? One of the things that I love and what we learn from our Indigenous brothers and sisters is that communities more explicitly, our Indigenous folks plan for 7 generations out. Right? They are saying that the decisions that we make today, how do we make decisions to ensure that not just our grandchildren, but our great-grandchildren and our great-great-grandchildren and our great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren benefit from what we are doing even today, so that we can leave a different legacy to ensure that we all thrive. So, just moving us quickly through this piece, next slide. What has centered our work has really been around key principles. And these principles are not things that we came up with. It is literally the wisdom that flows through our folks who have always been centering key guiding lights for how we should move. Whether it was the environmental justice, Jemez principles, the solidarity economy, these were the things that folks said. How do we invest in people and build out the civic infrastructure? What does it mean to truly support self-determination strategies? How do we bridge and build more holistic communities, because communities don't live single lives? And really thinking about the integrated pathway, so that we're not just talking about transportation, because when we made investments, even 10 years ago, just talking about transportation, what happened was that housing and displacement became part of the conversation. So this is why when we talk about the Thriving Communities Network and what's being built and the critical nature of these agencies coming together and having federal partners across issue areas coming together, why it's so critical. Because if we just focus on housing, but we don't think about the land use component on the transportation side, we just have blight. We can't get to where we need to go to. We see the suburbanization of poverty. We see that you have to drive to qualify. So we actually have to have a different conversation. And if we're not having the conversations about the air quality, about where we're putting the highways, then what we have are the same communities who now struggle with health concerns because of what's playing itself out, right? We know this. So we can build something different. Really centering the wisdom of community, being responsible and accountable, and where we can, repairing past harm. And acknowledging that. The thing that I sit with is that because we built out our interstate system during the 1960s, it was a time where Plessy versus Ferguson was the law of the land. Separate and equal but unequal realities was what guided our nation's history as we put out several of what we're talking about now, what would have been through inflation trillions of dollars that divided us by race and class. So in this moment, and I want you to understand that, because every time we fill a pothole, what we are doing is reinforcing many of those same systems that are dividing us. So what does it look like in this moment where we have $4 trillion to reimagine what it looks like to invest in place, not just projects? That is what is happening when we talk about mobilizing for this moment. So for us, it's really, how do we work with the coalition of the willing, the networks of the networks, creating the enabling conditions for systems change, working with the influencers of influencers for us to advance change. What we created, again, as I sit in what didn't exist 2 years ago, We created the Communities First Infrastructure Alliance to really bring together national TA groups, funders across the country, and regional partners, many who are in this room, to think about how do we do information sharing? Because we know that knowledge is power, and the reality is many of us don't have access. But today, by the time I am done, you will have the information necessary to go back to your communities and really speak to what it means to meet this moment. And it is our hope through our fund. So Communities First is not just the Alliance, but we also are a fund. And outside on the table, you'll have more information, but over the next couple of months, and honestly, the next 3 years, we will be investing in several regions across the country, but the Southeast is one of the places where we're gonna double down on. So what does it look like to build out the long-term relationships in the civic infrastructure? Because this money will go. It is not meant to destabilize you. How do we build you up in a way so that you may be able to thrive? I wanna just ground in the magnitude of this moment by talking about the bamboo, because it is just the best example of how I think about this work in this moment. What is so powerful about the bamboo, particularly depending on which type we're talking about, is that it is as strong as steel. But what is so powerful about it is that it is able to withstand any change that is happening around it. And as we are entering into a new political cycle where we may not know what is coming, what is powerful is that it can bend, but it doesn't break. And what we are building in this moment is the opportunity for a movement. But what I want to sit in is that for 5 years, and I don't know if you know what it means to grow something, but to water it, to toil it, to ensure that it is being cared for 5 years, you see absolutely nothing. 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 But in the 5th year, it grows exponentially in 5 weeks, 50 feet. And once it comes up, you can't take it down. In this moment, when we are talking about a bipartisan infrastructure law we are already in year 2. It is a 5-year bill. You don't see it right now. But if we plant the seeds and we start to toil, what they won't see is what's happening below the surface. Because what's playing itself out below the surface of the bamboo is an interconnected root system that allows it not to be uprooted. In many ways, it is a weed. You can't take it out once it grows, because in those 5 years, what is playing itself out is that it is digging deep. When we talk about building out the civic infrastructure, it is the opportunity to build and partner in such a way that regardless of the political cycle that may play itself out in this next year, 2 years, 4 years from now, if we collectively build the future that we hope to see, we will bend, but we will not break. They may try to uproot us, but they can't take us out. This is the magnitude of this moment. Do you understand? Okay. All right. So I've got 5 minutes to now explain what we're about to do. All right. So I want to unpack the money that we're talking about. And for Communities First, we ground in the ARPA funding in part because the American Rescue Plan really was the first time that we saw the numbers of trillions. And I want to kind of ground back to ARA. The American Recovery Act of 2009. And I want to ground it in my own lived experience as someone who was working for local government at that time. During the 2009 recession, The federal government put out $800 billion with a B. That was the largest amount of money that the federal government had spent at that time. And they bailed out the banks and the auto industry at $800 billion. I mean, just coming out from Detroit 2 weeks ago, in this moment where they are trying to negotiate for benefits because 10 years ago, we didn't know if there would be a Ford. We didn't know which of the car makers were going to survive. They are now profiting at numbers that are our taxpayer dollars. But we bailed out the banks and the auto industry at $800 billion. And so in 2021, spring of 2021, when they put out $1.9 trillion for the COVID recovery response, I was like, trillion with a T. Okay. But then by the fall, they passed the infrastructure bill at $1.2 trillion. We were at $3.1 trillion with a T. And I was like, I don't think people really understand what just happened. Congress passed the COVID response and the infrastructure response at $3.1 trillion with a T, 4 times the amount of money that we use to bail out the banks and the auto industry is what is now being unlocked to your communities. Are you feeling it? Has this money reached you? That is intentional. I want you to look at when this money has to be obligated. Obligated means that there has to be a plan to spend it down. It has to be spent down by December 31st, 2026 for the COVID money, and for the infrastructure money, it will be FY 2026. So that is September 30th, 2025. 18 months from now. That is why we're in this room in this moment. 4 times the amount of money. Okay, but that's not it. Then last summer, there was a Build Back Better plan. It had housing as infrastructure and other social benefits. That didn't get passed. The climate portion did at $400 billion. I was like, well, that's not really going to impact us. This piece actually has a 10-year lifespan, and it's tax credits, private sector investments. And I was like, oh my God, what are we gonna do? I'm gonna talk a little bit more about direct pay so that you can understand that this is about to be the most game-changing portion of all of the trillions that I talk about in this moment. And then on top of that, the Science and Chips Act, and while we don't organize around that, that got passed at almost 400. So we are now talking about $4 trillion has been passed in the last 2 years. If you don't understand how to take your Biden billions and make it work for your communities, it is a missed opportunity, my friend. Because if you choose not to organize and mobilize around this money, this will be the projects that you will be organizing against in the next 10 years. So, are you ready? Okay, so let's take this. Next slide. All right, so the ARPA money, what I want you to know from this is that what Treasury also offered was greater flexibility. We were only talking about responding to the healthcare pandemic, and many of us, we still are dealing with what that really means. But what they also offered was flexibility to say, hey, if you still have your COVID money, you can actually use it for infrastructure investment and other pieces. We were like, what? Okay, so when people are saying there's not money for matches and other pieces, you should be able to say, well, what happened to that COVID money? Where are we with that as part of that? The next key piece was the infrastructure investment. And this is the largest investment in clean water, and we're gonna have the water folks talking tomorrow, public transit, passenger rail, the power grid, tech pollution, clean energy and electric buses, internet. I mean, I just want to go back. There were 375 new unique programs created, almost 400 new programs, 125 new. So when we talk about this, what I would say is we pulled out the 25 that we thought community-based organizations could actually really organize around to think about what it looks like. Because it's a lot of programs. We know that you won't be able to understand all of it. The other key piece is this Inflation Reduction Act, when we talk about it, it is meant to incentivize truly us really thinking about what does a clean energy deployment look like? What does it mean to really address environmental justice? When Matt talks about that several billions of dollars, $2 billion specifically, it's from the Inflation Reduction Act as part of that. For us, there were resources in IRA that were game-changing and will be game-changing. One of those pieces is the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. In this room, you have folks who have applied over this money. This money is going to include things like solar for all, things like programs to ensure that you may be able to have a better understanding of how you ensure greater affordability for your home. And I'm going to explain more about that one when we get to direct pay. The other key piece here is the climate justice block grants, and that includes the $50 billion that we were talking about that's going to be going out to communities. It also includes the climate pollution reduction grants, where every state was invited to be able to put together a planning grant and then compete for $5 billion. You should be able to ask your state, did you submit a plan? But don't worry, EPA shared what those plans are. More importantly, you need to understand what those plans are, and how you ensure that your projects are part of those plans so that you can actively compete as part of that conversation. For the greenhouse gas piece, the thing that I would want you to know, more importantly, is that there are going to be 3 main programs. The one that you should know for sure is Solar for All. All of that money has to be spent in low-income and disadvantaged communities, all of it. Every state had the opportunity to apply for it. EPA has made it transparent so that you know who are the folks who put notices of intent around it. And then there will be now 2, essentially a green bank and regional hubs that will allow you to organize. Tomorrow afternoon, it is our hope for us to have a conversation with folks who are applying in this moment. Why? Because I don't know how many of you all build with your CDFIs, but you need to know some. Because they have several billions of dollars in the tune of $20 billion that can be leveraged to really support your work. Again, the earnest money is going to be what comes through things like the climate change grant, but what you use to get the rest of the money will be things like the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund and thinking about this. Matt talked about the climate justice community change grant. We will have folks from the staff talk a little bit more about what that means this afternoon so that you have a better understanding. As Matt also shared, he talked about the grant making program, and these are specifically just for EJ groups and community-based organizations. This piece that I want you to know about the grant making program, we have some amazing partners in this room who are sitting ready to be awarded this money. So what we feel very excited about is that there are partners. When Matt said that they went and found partners, they went and found partners. And the goal is that EPA can be taken out of the mix so that the bureaucracy does not limit you, so that you can go to trusted intermediaries like hopefully Babcock and other foundations to really come and get the resources that you need. And it doesn't mean that you're not going to have oversight and all the other pieces, but it does mean that you have an easier way because it is an opportunity for you to be in trusted relationship with folks that you are already in relationship with as part of this conversation. They also want to incentivize for folks to actually be in relationship with their government. So whether it's the government-to-government program or the problem-solving grant, it's really an opportunity for you to be able to engage in different ways around the issues that are impacting your communities as part of that. I love this slide because I think it's the best way that EPA MBA has really shared how this all comes together. Because I know some of you all have heard about the technical assistance centers, the TIC-TACs. The goal is that you may be able to go to the TIC-TAC and say, hey, I have a community plan, a vision. I want to understand what are the resources that are being made available. They are the navigators in really thinking about how you meet this moment. And then once you go there, the hope is that you may be able to get some resources, maybe through the Grant Makers program, to really start thinking about what are the planning and the projects for the plans that you've been talking about. And then potentially work with your government entities, because we don't own a lot of these projects and assets. But what does it look like to incentivize some of those pieces as part of that, so that you can get to that place where you can be part of that implementation piece through the environmental justice change grants? It's a beautiful spectrum. But we actually have to do the work. I talked a little bit more about the climate pollution reduction grant. All of these slides will be made available. I just need you to know that these things are available. What you need to ask around this specific program is, how is your state right now taking advantage of it? The other piece that I want to explain, and this one is going to be a little bit technical, but tomorrow you're going to actually also have David talk about it some more, is the direct pay. And the best way that I can tell this story is actually through my church. So, for the longest time growing up, we always had a building fund. We still have not sold enough turkey and chicken dinners to change the roof, y'all. I mean, we over a generation at this time, and the roof still is out of order. And the church van is also kind of struggling, y'all. And so what direct pay was offering was a different way for you to be able to actually get the benefits. So what the Office of Clean Energy and Innovation, and we're going to have Allison Cassidy here tomorrow, and I'm so excited, what they essentially said was, hey, in the past, when we've tried to do these tax credits, the challenge with it is that you actually have to file on the back end. So you have to put out the money before you can actually get the incentive. They said, hey, what if we change the equation? What if we issued you the check in advance? I said, the IRS can give you a check in advance? They said, yep, if you're an eligible entity, you can. I said, well, who are the eligible entities? They said tribes, community-based organizations, 501, whatever you want to be, can have access to this. I said, what? So my church could actually benefit from this? Yes. So let's say, let me just do it plain language so that you have a better sense. Let's say that this roof that we've been working on for my whole generation, we're just gonna make it plain, $100,000 is what we needed. With direct pay, they said, hey, but if you put solar on it, we can give you 20%. I'm like, okay, that's $20,000 right there. They said, you want to change the stoves too? I said, yeah. They've been cooking on it, and I'm not quite sure. I mean, I thought I can't even tell you when the stove got in there, and okay. So they said, we'll give you another 10. I said, what? They said, yeah. And then depending on your neighborhood, you could get 48E, which offers a bonus tax credit, maybe up to 20, 30%. I'm like, the math is mathing right now. With the tax credits, maybe 50% of this project, up to 70% of the project could be done just through a tax credit. So where I may have typically had to, we still raising, right? In this moment, because of the direct pay, we have an opportunity potentially to say $70,000 gets issued to you if you decide that you're going to make your church completely off the grid, clean energy benefits, so that we can help, live more healthy and benefit from the investments. And so I only have to come up with $30K. I think we can do this. Then they said, hey, the church van, if you buy an EV, we'll give you a tax credit for that. So if you were going to buy something in a different category, we'll give you 20%. That's what we're talking about. And they're going to issue you the check up front. And guess what? It's for the next 10 years. There's no limits. You don't have to compete. You just have to have the vision. Okay, y'all understand? Okay. David will talk a little bit more. We'll have a breakout session. What I want you to know is that ultimately, the White House is pulling everything that they can to really think about how we meet this moment. Technical assistance resource guides, executive orders, as Matt talked about, really thinking about just not climate change, but also how we address racial equity and supporting communities as part of that. If you don't know anything, what I do want to give this administration credit for is that they've tried to figure out a way to put it all together. So Invest.gov, there are going to be 3 websites that I need you to know. And if you know these 3 websites, you will have everything that you need to know to meet this moment. Invest.gov is the umbrella and the branding that the Biden-Harris administration uses to talk about that clean energy portfolio, infrastructure resources that we're talking about. If you go to Invest.gov, they have put everything that you need to know about all of the federal funding that has been flowing, those $4 trillion, Invest.gov. But more importantly, we were like, but what about the private sector and who's investing there? They said, we'll do one better. You can even see what private sector investors are making investments in your communities, because those may be the places that you might have to be doing some different organizing around as part of that. It also lists out all the public investment that has been spent to date as part of it. The other key piece is this technical assistance, and I want to pull out the Thriving Communities Network because though they humbly talked about how they've been doing this work, the game changer about the Thriving Communities Network is that it is a whole of government approach. We have not seen this level of interagency coordination around technical assistance explicitly, but more importantly, the principles that are guiding the work are things that we haven't seen the federal government talk about: building community wealth, centering the power of community, being able to meet the areas of greatest needs, and even diversify the knowledge. And I want to emphasize this piece more importantly, because when we have this conversation about capacity building and what it means, you all have been saying, everyone has been contacting me and calling me. It's intentional, y'all. They can't get the grant without you. You asked for it, they did it. And now you're saying you don't want them to. We got to choose, y'all. Either you're going to play, or again, it's going to be the thing that you're going to be playing against. So we need to think about how we meet this moment. The agencies have been investing across the country, but what I would say is that the reason why Communities First has really been organizing around the 10 federal regions is because it is how EPA, HUD, and DOT already organize around. So you are in what is considered Region 4. You should know this because that's how a lot of the resources are flowing. But what is very interesting is that there are key agencies that have offices in every single state. The Federal Highways Administration, USDA, HUD. You should know that. And later on this afternoon, we'll have some representatives talking a little bit more. But this is important because in places like the South where you're saying, hey, the state does not allow us to really engage in the ways that we want to. Guess what? You don't have to go to Washington. Washington is in your state and in your region. You just need to know who to connect with as part of that. They'll be in the room today. The other key piece that I want you to know is Build.gov. This infrastructure money is not small dollars. And so we'll have folks from the drinking water team and others talking a little bit more about it. But what I will say is that the White House has made all the information available. So they've provided both rural playbook, tribal playbook, state-by-state fact sheets. If you want to know what money is still available or needs to be available, or if you have to go to your state and you're saying, hey, what has been spent? They update it quarterly. You will know by sector what money has been allocated, so that you now have the knowledge to have a very different conversation with your state and local entities about the resources that are flowing in your area. The other key piece is people are like, it's so much money, we don't know what's coming next. They put out the literally open funding of what is available for the quarter. Every quarter, they update this information. I have to give full credit to the Build team as part of this, the bipartisan infrastructure law team. And even on workforce development and really thinking about this, they literally then also put out the resources that they've put. And I want to spend a moment on this just to unpack the reason why we're here for Liberation 100, because when you think about the federal money that's flowing, particularly on the infrastructure funding, 90% of that money, and each agency has a different percentage, but overall, 90% of that money is actually being spent and directed by the states. It's called formula funding. There's no way around it. And the resources that the agencies have around those monies is about 10%. So when we start to say, hey, Justice 40, it is a beautiful vision, and we think that it's critical. But if we have a dollar bill and 90 cents is going to the states and 10 cents is going to the federal government, when we say we're organizing just around Justice 40, we're talking about 4 cents, y'all. I'm here for the 96 cents. Liberation 100. So when Christopher says we have a different perspective, and not because the vision isn't right, but guess what? You can have your own version of Justice 40 in your state. The same way that President Biden put out an executive order saying that there needed to be a set-aside, guess what you could do? You could advocate to ensure that there's a set-aside for your resources. One of the first things that happened when the bipartisan infrastructure law got passed was that every state had to actually create and have someone identified as an infrastructure coordinator. Do you know who your infrastructure coordinator is? Okay, so you have some assignments then, I guess. Because these are the folks who are organizing around the 90, but you don't even know who they are. And you've never had a conversation or even asked for transparency around the money. How is the 90 cents being spent? And how does it work in service to your communities? All right, so like I shared, Build.gov, Invest.gov has a state-by-state fact sheets so that you can understand what's available. Cleanenergy.gov is where you will be able to find everything that you need to know about the Inflation Reduction Act. It even gives you, again, where the private sector investments are being made and the public sector investments that are made. So in summary, what are the 3 places in which you may be able to secure the information that you need to know about the money that is being made available and meeting this moment? Hello? Invest.gov, Build.gov, and Cleanenergy.gov. With that, I want to thank you because you now know everything that you need to know to both mobilize for action and meet this moment. Thank you so much. You all have been so patient. We are going to now go into breakouts, and I'm going to have Helen Chin bring us up to move us as the next steps.